bibliophiles of the internet. Today I'm back to share my October wrap-up. October was yet another unpredictable reading month for me. I read a lot of things that were on my priority TBR and even more that were not, but in the end I read another 16 books, so let's just get started. I actually finished not one, but two books on the first day of the month. The first of those was The Transition by Logan Ashley Kisner. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Scott Turner Schofield. This is a queer YA paranormal horror story about a trans boy named Hunter who spent his winter break recovering from top surgery, and he's super excited to spend the last few months of high school feeling comfortable in his own skin. But all of that goes to hell when he is viciously attacked by some kind of wild animal in the woods. The attack was so violent that he very nearly lost his life, so initially he's just happy to be alive, but then he realizes that the injuries he sustained from the attack aren't healing normally and might slowly but surely be transforming him into a werewolf. Content warnings for graphic depictions of blood and injury, experienced bullying and transphobia, explorations of gender dysphoria and internalized transphobia, scenes involving animal death, including off-page pet death, brief depictions of panic attacks, references to sexual assault, some depictions of self-harm and self-harm ideation due to involuntary impulses, and instances of body horror, including depictions of things that might mirror medical detransition. Also worth noting, as I said, the main character is trans, but he's also bisexual, and his two closest friends are also queer and non-cis. It's been a second since I've read a really gritty, groundbreaking YA trans horror story, and this one really blew me away. I would say if you love anything by Andrew Joseph White, that feels like a very natural fit, and I think you would love this. This is a perfectly titled, perfectly conceptualized take on a shifter story, especially when we're paralleling the concept of transitioning into a monster with what it's like for trans people to transition in various areas of their life. What I really love about this story is its commitment to exploring how transition of any kind is often ugly and messy and uncomfortable. It is the furthest thing from easy or glamorous, and there are so many hideously awkward in-between stages that, again, coming from a trans perspective, can make you feel less than human, which weirdly makes this idea of unwillingly transforming into a werewolf the perfect metaphor for that experience. The process of transition is so often romanticized, or we form our own conception of what it means to quote-unquote truly transition by looking at these extreme before and after images where the differences speak for themselves. We also often treat those after images as the goal or the destination, when the truth is that transition looks different for every single person, and for a lot of different reasons, not everyone will or even wants to quote-unquote pass. We need stories like this that depict the violence and discomfort of transition, and also forced detransition as its own kind of body horror in a sense, as a kind of upheaval of body and life in ways that we cannot control or predict. I feel like this story is really an answer to anti-trans propaganda that's meant to fearmonger and scare young trans people especially into not transitioning, convincing them that they will quote-unquote ruin their bodies or that these changes are irreversible and permanent, when the more complicated truth is that nothing is permanent and nothing is guaranteed. Even if you surpass these so-called transitional milestones, even if you medically transition, even if you legally transition, even if you receive trans-affirming surgeries or treatments, then you have to fight to keep those things or to not lose access to those things. So I feel like this story adequately addresses both sides of the coin. There's an ugliness to transitioning, and there's also an ugliness to detransitioning, and both are horrific, or at the very least uncomfortable and unpredictable in their own ways. Honestly, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more about this story and its execution that I loved so much. The characters are deeply fucked up and incredibly dynamic. The main friend group at the center also subverts the love triangle trope in really exciting ways. I definitely want to read more from this author in the future, and I highly recommend this one. I gave it 4.75 stars. The other book I finished on October 1st was A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez. I also listened to this as an audiobook, which is read by Lee Osorio, Annette Amelia Olivera, Sol Madariaga, and Maria Laites. This is a collection of supernatural horror stories. All the stories are set in Argentina or centering Argentinian characters, and they're described as being about ordinary people, especially women, whose lives turn inside out when they encounter terror, the surreal, and the supernatural. Content warnings for instances of body horror, death, and blood, references to rape and sexual assault, some depictions of violence, allusions to forced institutionalization, instances of ableist and fatphobic language, as well as internalized fatphobia, including references to disordered eating, and some instances of parent death and animal death. Short story collections are always kind of tough to summarize and review, so I'm going to keep this brief, but I thought this was a pretty strong collection of stories. Each new concept was distinctive and dynamic, and I think each story takes a familiar idea like a haunting or a shocking death and twists it ever so slightly so that it really sticks in your brain. The opening story, I think, is a really great example of that because it posits the question of what if instead of a haunted house, the entire neighborhood was haunted? What if there was an entire community of people being simultaneously terrorized by ghosts? That's a really evocative spin on a classic concept that I find really fascinating, and there was that same sort of thoughtful extrapolation to be found in many of the other stories. So overall, I found the stories in this collection to be as compelling as they were creepy. Of course, there were some that I liked much more than others, which is why in the end, this one averages out to about 4 stars. The next 2 books I read were both by the same author, and their project is very similar, so I'm going to kind of talk about them together. I will summarize and give content warnings for both of them, then review them together. The first of those is Strange Houses by Uketsu, translated by Jim Ryan from the original Japanese. This is an unconventional mystery thriller story where creepy floor plans play a major part in the story. It follows a writer whose friend is considering buying a house in Tokyo, and that friend sends the writer a copy of the floor plan to get his opinion on whether this would be a smart investment. The writer notices something very strange in the floor plan and decides to get a second opinion from an architect, only to discover that this seemingly normal house is hiding even more strange spaces. Content warnings for descriptions of murder, death, and dismemberment, brief references to alcohol abuse and drunk driving, non-graphic references to bullying and abuse, brief non-graphic references to incest, some descriptions of self-harm, and a brief reference to suicide. And I was so fascinated by Strange Houses that I dove right into Strange Pictures, also by Uketsu and once again translated by Jim Ryan. This is another horrific mystery thriller. It's a novel, but it's kind of structured as 3 short stories about unsettling drawings that don't seem to relate on the surface, but turn out to be interconnected. There's a defunct blog containing an expectant mother's sketches, a child's picture of his home that contains a dark message, and a sketch made by a murder victim in his final moments. Content warnings for references to parental death and grief, allusions to childhood trauma and depictions of child abuse, brief scenes involving animal cruelty, some graphic depictions of injury and violence, mentions of suicide, and brief descriptions of sexual assault and sexual threats. To start off, there's a very good reason why this author and these books have become a runaway hit in Japan. There is something extremely compelling about them, a kind of underlying darkness that makes it really hard to tear yourself away once you find yourself in the story. And both of these books also use visual media extremely effectively, especially in a way that transforms something unsuspecting into something sinister with just a few words or a different angle on an image. That's a very hard feat to accomplish, and I think that's absolutely the strongest part of both of these stories. The fact that they appear very unassuming on the surface, and the kind of horror that is gradually being revealed is very subtle and almost quiet in some ways. Uketsu also has a very distinctive style of storytelling and narration. I wouldn't say that either of these books are especially character-driven. If you need to deeply understand or know a character and get a deep sense of what motivates them, these may not be the books for you. That doesn't make them bad or unsuccessful, it just means that they serve a different purpose. You can't go into these books expecting to find fully realized, well-rounded, distinctive characters with rich backstories, because these stories are less about the characters themselves and more about revealing to the reader this disturbing underbelly hidden beneath the facade of normality that society is committed to performing in so many ways. To me, Uketsu's stories are meant to unsettle the audience and to disturb these sites of safety, such as the home or childhood itself, to the point where they become virtually unrecognizable and their true sinister nature is then pushed to the forefront. Like I said, there's something so incredibly compulsive about both of these books, perhaps because the characters act as vehicles to understanding the dark nature of humankind that is often missed or overlooked. That said, I don't think they're entirely successful because they both go off the rails a bit towards the end, and a lot of the resolution for both of them is dependent on conjecture or assumptions, which doesn't always feel grounded or satisfying in the way the stories truly deserve. But they're both almost impossible to look away from, which is really a testament to the author's storytelling skills. I would definitely read another book like this from Uketsu, and I gave both of these 3.75 stars apiece. Then I listened to my ALC of The Isle in the Silver Sea by Tasha Suri. I was kindly gifted included a review copy by Orbit and also access to the audiobook courtesy of both Hachette Audio and Libro FM. The audiobook is read by Shiromi Arserio. This is a standalone sapphic romantic fantasy. It's a fated lover story inspired by medieval folklore set in a fantastical version of Britain where stories are living things, and the land itself only exists because there are certain fixed stories that get told again and again across generations and lifetimes. The two main characters, a witch named Simran and a knight named Vina, are two such people known as incarnates, basically key figures in an integral story that plays out again and again across lifetimes, and they are doomed to both love each other and destroy each other in this lifetime and the next. Content warnings for some graphic descriptions of death, injury, and violence, some scenes involving mind control, some descriptions of imprisonment and torture, and some sexual content. I'll start by saying that I did really enjoy this, but it didn't blow me away or rock my world by any stretch of the imagination. I do think it's a really smart and innovative spin on a typical knight's quest as well as the reincarnated soulmates trope, but truthfully I was hoping for a bit more from the story that I just didn't get, and that's okay. That said, I do really respect the project of this story, which is about exploring how unchecked and unquestioning allegiance to nationalism or patriotism is incredibly dangerous and insidious, and how replicating cycles of history doesn't make a land or a people stronger. In fact, resistance to change is a profound weakness. That's the whole idea behind the world building, that these stories, these pieces of history, have to play out exactly the way they've always played out, because that quote-unquote preserves the integrity of the land. Therefore, these stories cannot ever be changed or broken. But the question, of course, is who then benefits from this so-called preservation? What kinds of stories are seen as necessary to the fabric of this land and its people, and why? Those are interesting and incredibly relevant questions that I really appreciate the story asking, and I did find it fascinating to see how these characters are both integral to the land as incarnates, and yet at the same time they're not seen as being entitled to that same land because of their otherness. There's a very clear through line in the story about how nationalist or supremacist ideologies have to position otherness as a threat to the integrity of a place and its continued existence in order for those in power to retain that power, when in fact otherness demands a place and its people to grow and evolve and become more expansive. I think that's a very clear message in the story that's explored well in a lot of different ways, but even with that in mind, I did have some issues with the characterization, the core relationship dynamics, which I found to be a little bit lacking, and the world building itself. I think where this story runs into a little bit of trouble is the fact that the characters are very self-aware when it comes to the fact that they are incarnates. They know their story and they know the role they're meant to play. Sometimes that self-awareness comes in handy, but in some ways it makes the story feel more convoluted and it becomes much more difficult to cleanly execute. That level of self-awareness brings up a lot of questions about the way these stories and incarnates function that I'm not sure the story ever satisfactorily reconciles with, and the questionable world building also made it harder for me to really buy into the romance at the level this kind of story really depends on. But overall, again, there's some really compelling ideas being explored in this story. It's incredibly lush and beautifully written as well. There were some sticking points for me when it came to execution, but I still thought this was a pretty strong read overall. In the end, I gave it a solid 3.75 stars. After that, I did some reading for my recent Frankenstein Book Recs video. The first Frankenstein-inspired book I read was Chicano Frankenstein by Daniel A. Olives. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Tom Rivera. This is a small book published by an indie press. It's set in a near-future version of the US where the process of reanimation, that is synthetically piecing corpses together with dead body parts and bringing them to life, has become fairly commonplace, especially as a way to replenish the diminishing workforces. But even though there's economical gain, there's a sect of people, including the president, who are staunchly anti-reanimation and are actively passing legislation that strips the reanimated community of their basic rights. The main character is an unnamed reanimated paralegal who finds himself falling in love for the first time, even as he tries to navigate an ever-shrinking world. And he also wants to learn more about his first life history, which was all but erased with the reanimation process. Content warnings for experienced racism and xenophobia, including hate crimes, references to parental death, some body horror, and some sexual content. I found this to be a surprisingly domestic, slice-of-life kind of story. While it isn't explicitly and overtly political story that makes the reader very aware of what's at stake socially and legally for the characters, it's not about dismantling the system or even engaging directly with the powers that be. It's not about protest, it's not about overthrowing the government, it's not about challenging the conditions of injustice, but rather it's about naming those injustices and naming how they show up on a day-to-day basis and exploring the question of how we survive in a world that not only doesn't want us to survive, survive, but isn't even built for us to survive. The story doesn't say it in so many words, but the reanimated community is very obviously a metaphorical stand-in for immigrant communities, especially Latina immigrants. And in that way, the story is also speaking to how the United States specifically is more than happy to exploit the labor and bodies of brown immigrants, but still refuses to count them as real citizens, and in many ways as human beings worthy of dignity and life and protections. So even though it's a quieter, smaller scale story, there are still big questions being asked about what it means to be considered human, to be considered worthy of space and life, and what it means to truly belong to a place. There's also some through lines about how the pressure to assimilate to the dominant culture can be very dangerous, and how marginalized communities especially have to balance this question of whether to erase themselves or prioritize their own safety. So I appreciate those conversations as well. I do wish the story did a little bit more and had a bit more content. I think the title Chicano Frankenstein is doing a lot of heavy lifting in what the reader projects onto the nameless main character, but the story never actually speaks to his identity and his cultural history or the blending thereof in any kind of meaningful way. But overall, I'm glad I finally read this. It was morbidly endearing in a lot of ways and focused on bringing a sense of dignity and complexity to the main character as opposed to having a lot of plot movement, and that's a trade-off that I can respect. I gave it 3.5 stars. The other Frankenstein-inspired book I read last month was a middle grade story called Stitch by Porig Kenny. Walker Books kindly sent me a finished copy, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Will Watt. This is a really fun and adventurous Frankenstein retelling for kids. It follows a young character named Stitch who was synthetically brought to life in a lab by a single-minded scientist. But when the professor's evil nephew takes over the lab, Stitch and his best friend Henry Oaf begin to feel uneasy because this nephew wants to use them both as fodder for much more dangerous experiments. So they decide that trying to make a life for themselves in the human world might be their only viable choice. Content warnings for explorations of death and grief, instances of discrimination, some scenes involving physical assault, some brief depictions of a manic episode, brief non-graphic mentions of animal death, and brief depictions of fire-related trauma. I was so charmed by this story. I think it's a great way to introduce young readers to Frankenstein, especially its thematic work regarding personhood, the value of humanity, and what it means to truly be monstrous in a way that's accessible and great for all ages. If you have a young reader in your life that you like to share audio experiences with, I also think the audiobook is so much fun. Will Watt does so many great character voices and really brings the story to life with his incredible energy and performance. I've talked about this book in my last couple of videos, and as I've said before, I just think this is a really thoughtful, open-hearted story about a young hero who is less concerned with whether he quote-unquote deserves the life he has, but instead is determined to do good with the life he has and to do right by other folks. I think that's a really great message for young readers, that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what your circumstances might be, as long as you strive to do what's right whenever and however you can, that's going to become your legacy, and that's going to be what people remember when they think of you. So I had a lot of fun with this. I think it's a smart, fun, and sincere take on Frankenstein for younger audiences, and I would definitely recommend it. I gave it 4.5 stars. On a very different note, because October is a pretty big month for baseball, I was inspired to finally pick up The Art of Catching Feelings by Alicia Thompson. Berkeley Romance kindly sent me a finished copy, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Kristen Sia. This is an adult romance about a character named Daphne, who just finalized her divorce and decides the best way to celebrate is to go to a professional baseball game and drown her sorrows in ballpark booze. But the thing is, she knows nothing about baseball, nothing about the home team, and after getting a little bit too drunk, she ends up heckling the players from the stands. There's one player in particular, Chris Kepler, who ends up breaking down after she heckles him. And of course, she feels horrified and decides to reach out on social media after the fact to apologize. The two of them end up exchanging messages, and it isn't until they're pretty deep in the conversation that Daphne realizes she forgot to identify herself as the heckler in her initial message. Content warnings for a brief instance of verbal harassment, some descriptions of drunkenness and vomit, non-graphic mentions of sibling death by suicide, and some explorations of grief, brief descriptions of pregnancy complications with a side character, some depictions of anxiety and panic attacks, and some explicit sexual content. I'll be honest, this one kind of gave me mixed feelings. I did have a fun time listening to it overall because the characters had a really great sense of chemistry both emotionally and physically, and also because it's an interesting twist on a sports romance, but because of the story's conceit, I also wasn't able to fully connect or completely suspend my belief in some ways. My biggest note is that I think the story is too convoluted for its own good. There's just too much going on. And while failing to disclose the fact that she's the heckler is an honest mistake to make once, it becomes harder to give Daphne the benefit of the doubt every moment afterwards that she consciously decides not to disclose that information. I don't know if we want to call that misinformation, miscommunication, catfishing, but whatever it is, I don't love it. And I will admit that the synopsis is pretty upfront about how that's a main plot point, so that's fully on me. I knew that going into it. However, I don't think the story even needs that plot point to be a compelling romance. The other part of this story is that this heckling incident goes viral, and as a sort of publicity stunt, the team reaches out to Daphne and wants to make her one of the sideline reporters for the rest of the season, thereby creating a sort of forced proximity, enemies to lovers, almost workplace romance dynamic between her and Chris. I feel like that in and of itself is a really solid setup, not only for a redemption arc, but for a romance. But when you add in the DMs and the catfishing elements, it's almost like Daphne ends up in a love triangle with another version of herself. And while it's true that romance does require complications and mess in order to be compelling, this just made things needlessly complicated and, at least for me, not very fun. So I have to say, for me, I was a little bit let down by this. I do consider myself a baseball fan. I love a good sports romance. This one was just a little too convoluted and depended on tropes that I don't super love, which again is absolutely on me. But broadly speaking, this was still a fun, breezy, sexy romance that was still the perfect palate cleanser my brain really needed at the time. I absolutely do plan to read more from this author. I think she has so much more to give, but I couldn't give this particular book any more than 3 stars. After that, I listened to one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and that was If the Dead Belong Here by Carson Faust. PRH Audio kindly granted me access to the audiobook, which is read by Charlie Flight, Amy Hall, Sean Taylor Corbett, Aaron Tripp, and El Mejia Tailfeathers. This is an indigenous take on a Southern Gothic. It's a story that's part mystery, part horror about a 6-year-old girl named Laurel who vanishes from her family home overnight without a trace. Her alcoholic mom and her older sister, Nadine, are left trying to search for her, and they also begin experiencing nightmares that blur the lines between dream and reality. And eventually they become convinced that Laurel's disappearance is connected to other family tragedies that have been buried over the years. Content warnings for some descriptions of alcohol abuse, addiction, and vomit, allusions to past experiences of domestic abuse and child abuse, references to suicide, some descriptions of physical abuse, injury, and self-harm ideation, experienced homophobia, some depictions of underage drinking and drug use, and some sexual content. Carson Faust is a debut author I discovered when I read his short story in Never Whistle at Night. I looked him up immediately after finishing his story in that anthology and saw that he had gotten a book deal for this debut novel, and trust me when I say that I began counting down the days from that very moment. And I have to say, Carson Faust did not let me down. This debut is dark, unsettling, haunting, and takes an unflinching look at the legacy of inherited trauma, especially how those inherited legacies disproportionately impact indigenous communities. What I think this story does incredibly well is that there's a really strong parallel between Laurel's quote-unquote imaginary friends who everyone believes have spirited her away, and the so-called invisible injustices that this family and this community face. These imaginary friends or spirits that Laurel was interacting with before her disappearance are invisible and can't be seen or interacted with by just anyone. There's even rules to who they appear to and how they appear, which of course makes it hard for the police and the media to consider these creatures a viable threat. But even though Laurel's mom and sister don't have a connection with these spirits themselves, they're having to reckon with the fact that even though most people can't see these creatures or don't even believe in these creatures, that doesn't change the very real grief and loss and torment that their family is having to contend with. And again, paralleling that to the very real systemic cycles of violence and poverty that Native nations continue to endure, forms of violence that are often rendered invisible to greater society by the virtue of Native erasure, and that makes a very powerful statement. That really speaks to how just because something can't be seen or quantified or brought in front of a judge doesn't mean it's not real, or that it doesn't have very real and profound impacts. So I really respect this story's project. I wouldn't say it's an easy read, but it is incredibly worthwhile in my opinion. It's a unique take on the concept of a Southern Gothic, especially from a Native perspective, and I think it just has so much to offer. I cannot wait to read more from Carson Faust, and I gave this debut a solid 4 stars. Then from my library, I read The Corruption of Hollis Brown by Kay Ancrum. This is a queer paranormal thriller and romance about a teenager named Hollis who's stuck in this suffocating small town where very few people are able to leave. And he's furious about it all the time, which often gets him into trouble because he channels his anger by getting into fights with his classmates. One night he meets a mysterious stranger and unknowingly makes a deal with him at the crossroads, and then finds himself losing control of his body and his mind as he becomes possessed. The stranger/ghost, Walt, is using Hollis's body as a vessel, and it turns out that he has a deep and violent history rooted in Hollis's hometown, as well as plenty of unfinished business that needs to be taken care of. Content warnings for some descriptions of bullying, physical assault, injury, and violence, depictions of depressive episodes, and allusions to self-harm ideation and suicide ideation. Shout out to my friend Andrea for convincing me to read this one when she reviewed it on Instagram. I actually read another Kate Ancrum book many, many moons ago and absolutely fucking hated almost everything about it, and I've never read or even wanted to read another one of her books. That is, until now. Surprisingly, I was incredibly taken by this story. Part of that is because I'm a sucker for a good queer possession story, and the vibes from this particular queer possession story were incredibly right. I feel like I've mentioned this at least in my last couple of wrap-ups, but I have a deep appreciation for stories that stretch the boundaries of how we express and understand queerness, not merely as an identity or as a label, but as a transgressive way of moving through the world and queering concepts of normality. And again, because this is a possession story where the main character is essentially forming a deeply intimate and even romantic bond with a spirit that can only exist within himself, that doesn't have its own outward vessel or body, that forces the characters to challenge their own conceptions of their queerness. When two souls are sharing the same body, how do those two souls experience and express intimacy? How do they communicate? How do they experience physicality? How do they share touch or comfort or closeness? I think those are really interesting questions, and the story does provide some very provocative answers. In that way, this is also very much a story about loneliness and finding people who remind you of why life is worth living and why life is worth fighting for, even when the world can be an incredibly harsh and unforgiving place. There's something so deeply personal and vulnerable about sharing a single body between two souls, and that forced spiritual proximity reveals so much about both of these characters to each other that they might not otherwise be able to truly understand. Something else I really responded to is how the story explores that it's both wondrous and horrifying to be truly known by someone else. Being possessed is very much an exercise in radical vulnerability for Hollis, who just wants to be seen and understood and respected. And part of being possessed means literally surrendering power over himself and allowing Walt to navigate the world on his behalf, essentially allowing Walt to understand and experience Hollis's literal worldview in a way that no one else ever has. That level of connection and surrender and intimacy is so heady and so profound that it makes it hard to tear yourself away from the story as it unfolds. In that respect, I also appreciate the way this story is formatted. It's written in these very short, punchy, dynamic chapters, which make it almost addictive to read. I do think Walt's backstory gets a little convoluted towards the end, and I think some of the relationship dynamics outside of Walt and Hollis's relationship could have been much stronger, but I still gave this 4 stars. After that, I listened to The Dead of Summer by Ryan Lasala. Scholastic kindly sent me a finished copy, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Arese Amokpe and Pete Cross. This is the first book in a new oceanic horror duology from Ryan Lasala. It's a queer YA horror story about a teenager named Ollie who is finally returning home to a small island off the East Coast called Anchor's Mercy. He had to leave for the mainland with his mom when she came down with cancer, but now she's finally cancer-free and wants them to go home so they can have the best summer ever and celebrate her good health. But Ollie isn't quite as excited as she is because he lost touch with his best friends while they were away, and to make things worse, he's beginning to suspect that everyone on the island is keeping a deadly secret that might explain not only his mom's illness, but the mysterious illness of so many other locals. Content warnings for references to cancer, some depictions of death, child death, and grief, brief references to experienced homophobia, mentions of suicide, some graphic depictions of injury, violence, and contagious illness, and some descriptions of body horror. First of all, this was a really fun audiobook to listen to. Not only is the main narrator incredibly personable and voicey, but there's also these interludes with found media, science journals, interview recordings that are really well produced and utilize some really cool audio effects. So I really did enjoy the listening experience. Aside from that though, I have to say this might be my least favorite book from Ryan so far, which isn't saying much, but is saying something. Don't get me wrong, it's still fantastic and weird and incredibly innovative. Ryan LaSala's mind is a truly bizarre and incredible place, and the fact that they're willing to let us inside is nothing short of a gift. But this is also Ryan's first time writing the first book in a series, and I think it kind of shows. I think because there's so much that has to be accomplished in this duology that it really condenses and compounds this first book's timeline. And on the one hand, that makes for an incredibly fast-paced story where a lot happens in a short amount of time and the stakes are incredibly high, but it also has the side effect of making things feel rushed or underdeveloped. It's hard because I really do trust the vision. I trust that Ryan is taking the story somewhere worthwhile, but without knowing the true trajectory of the duology, it's hard to say that this first book really succeeds on its own merits, if that makes sense. Again, I still think Ryan LaSala is a tremendous talent. I think this is a uniquely thrilling and disturbing oceanic horror story that has a lot to say about the dangers of willful ignorance and asks really compelling questions about exactly what and who we're willing to sacrifice for the sake of our own survival. But overall, I had to give this 3.75 stars. On yet another wildly different note, after that I read Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist by Liz Pelly. I listened to the audiobook from my library, which is read by the author herself. Liz Pelly is a longtime music journalist who's been chronicling the rise of the music streaming industry, and in this book she's examining how Spotify, one of the first and biggest music streaming services, has fundamentally changed the ways we listen to and consume music, often for the worse. This book is both investigating the origins of Spotify's business practices and business model, and also exploring how the massive rise in streaming often has negative consequences for both listeners and musical artists alike. There wasn't really any content in here that I flagged as being potentially triggering because a lot of these discussions are happening at a very high level. The book does explore things like exploitation and corporate greed, with some mentions of how those things impact marginalized communities, but again, nothing too in-depth or graphic or specific. Definitely have to give props to Nathan from Schizophrenic Reads for putting this one on my radar. He is a truly incredible resource for nonfiction recs. But I was really interested in this subject because I know that Spotify is basically the worst and most unethical music streaming service for reasons that are beyond the scope of this particular book, but I wanted to educate myself and learn more about the company, its origins, and its heinous business practices. This book is so incredibly insightful and informative about how Spotify, as one of the first and biggest music streamers, has profoundly changed the way that we interact with and consume music on a daily basis. One thing I didn't know is that Spotify actually started out as an ad service, as a service primarily built to share advertisements, which really speaks volumes to their business model and should inspire you to ask critical questions about what exactly they're trying to sell you and what exactly your subscription pays for. There's a now infamous quote from the CEO of Netflix about how Netflix's biggest competitor isn't another streaming service, but rather sleep itself, because their goal is to keep you on the platform for as long as possible, and ostensibly one of the biggest barriers stopping people from streaming Netflix 24 hours a day is the fact that we do have to sleep at some point. That in and of itself is a pretty horrifying thing to say, but Spotify actually has a very similar ethos, but instead of time or again another streaming service like Apple Music or YouTube Music, they view their biggest competitor as silence. Something this book is really diving into is the fact that the advent of music streaming has brought us to this age of passive music consumption. We might have artists or albums that we really love or deeply connect to, but on a day-to-day basis, we've entered into this economy of what's called laid-back listening, where we're just looking for a playlist or an album to play as background noise. Spotify especially has marketed us this idea that we need to soundtrack every moment of our lives, and while there's nothing inherently bad or harmful about that, it opens the door to passivity, to not caring whether the music we're listening to is high quality, whether it's created ethically, whether it's created by an artist or mass produced by a company, whether it's even created by a human or just AI generated slop. So that's one piece of it. The other big piece is how Spotify, again, not unlike any other streaming service or music streamer, is farming its user base for data, how it's tracking everything you click or look at, how many seconds or minutes you're listening to a song, when you skip, what playlists and genres you listen to, so on and so forth. And it's also using algorithms and now AI to tag songs or tracks in a way that flattens any nuance of the listening experience. Again, in such a way that makes you think that you're making the decisions about what you listen to, but in reality, they're pushing what they want you to hear to the forefront. This is just the very tip of the iceberg. There is so much more invaluable and thought-provoking information contained in this book that I simply do not have time to discuss. But I really appreciate how this book is so forthcoming about how Spotify and other music streamers operate, but it's also asking really great questions about how we can resist, how we can change or challenge the industry, and how artists can fight for the wages and access they truly deserve. If I had to give one note, I would say there were a few missed opportunities for this reporting to be even more intersectional and expand upon the ways these predatory business practices disproportionately affect marginalized artists and communities. But even with that in mind, this book is still 5 stars. Taking yet another dramatic pivot, after that I spontaneously decided to listen to Dead and Breakfast by Kat Hillis and Rosie Thor. Berkeley sent me a finished copy for review, and I listened to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by Daniel Henning. This is a queer, comedic, satirical, cozy paranormal mystery about two married vampires, Arthur and Sal, who are perfectly normal, besides the fact that they are vampires. They just want to live their quiet life and enjoy a quiet retirement, and to that end, they have finally opened up the bed and breakfast of their dreams. Unfortunately, they do live in a not so paranormal friendly town, and business is a bit slow, and to make things worse, just when they're trying to impress their first real guest, the town mayor shows up dead in their garden with 2 puncture wounds in his neck. Again, because this town isn't very accepting of paranormals, Arthur and Sal know they're going to be wrongfully accused of this crime. So with the help of a werewolf barista who moonlights as a lawyer, the elven town coroner, and the new human city manager, they will have to try and solve this murder themselves if they hope to prove their innocence. Content warning for instances of death, including attempted murder, some descriptions of injury and violence, and some explorations of experienced homophobia and prejudice. This is such a deeply unserious, lighthearted, satirical take on a cozy mystery, and I had such a fun time listening to it. Arthur and Sal are the textbook definition of amateur sleuths because they have absolutely no idea what they're doing, and anytime they think they're gaining ground, they're actually just making things worse. I think the dynamic between Arthur and Sal is also something that makes this mystery unique because while it's not technically a romance, it is romantic in its own way, and it's not often that we get to read about older queer married couples who've been together for a very long time and who are still finding ways to love and surprise their spouse. So that's a really fun and endearing underlying element to the story. The fact that these two characters are intimately familiar with each other's quirks and faults and are playing to those quirks and faults while trying to solve a mystery when they very well know that neither of them have any investigation skills. The fact that they have such horrible instincts actually makes their attempts to solve the case even more enthralling to read because you never know when they're going to stumble upon a promising lead or a dead end. So it kind of keeps you on your toes. I also appreciate that there's a subtle flavor of ACAB to the story because the characters know that they're going to be unfairly profiled and even mistreated by police simply because they're paranormals, and so they have to take things into their own hands if they hope to secure some kind of justice. And as they make new friends and acquaintances along the way who are trying to help them find answers and clear their names, the story gradually becomes an endearing and satisfying testament to the power of community and community-first justice. While the world building could have been a bit stronger and more expansive, especially in regards to the treatment of paranormals, this was still a really fun and funny mystery that I thoroughly enjoyed. It seems like there's a sequel already lined up for this one, and I cannot wait to read more from these characters. I gave this book 4 stars. Then I picked up my Patreon pick for the month, and the book my patrons voted for me to read in October was The Center by Aisha Manazir Siddiqui. This is an interesting melting pot of a story. It's part literary thriller, part speculative fiction, part social horror. The story is following a Pakistani translator named Anisa who dreams of translating great works of literature but is stuck subtitling Bollywood movies and generally feeling inadequate about her life. She starts dating this mediocre white guy named Adam who speaks a lot of different languages as part of his work, but she's still stunned when he becomes practically fluent in her native Urdu overnight. She eventually forces him to reveal his secret, and he tells her about the Center, which is an elite invite-only program that guarantees complete fluency in any language in just 10 days. Anisa believes this could be a huge game changer when it comes to her translation work, so she enrolls as soon as she can. But what Adam didn't tell her is the true cost of the Center's services. Content warnings for experienced racism and colonization, including Islamophobia and some use of racist slurs, some depictions of death, sexual content, and references to experiences of sexual assault and sexual harassment. Just as a quick note, Anisa is actually bisexual, and there's also a brief mention of Israeli colonization and a character who is a former member of the IDF. But that character is also not a good person, so take that as you will. I love the gratification you feel when you read a book that's been on your TBR forever and it absolutely lives up to your expectations. I had such a great time reading this. It starts off very quiet and unassuming, but gradually spirals into something so weird and so dark, and I think it has so many worthwhile things to say about how colonization, especially the colonization of language, is very much a form of violence. This is a story that really makes you think about how integral language is to the survival of and expression expression of a culture, how language can be a significant way that we connect with culture and history, and what it means when someone outside of that culture gains access to its language. Especially when it comes to something like what's happening at the center, where people aren't actually putting the care and the work into meaningfully connecting with a language, but rather just absorbing it wholesale, devoid of context, so that they might quote unquote enrich themselves and further their own lives. There's a lot in here about how colonizers are seen as wise and cultured and worldly when they deign to speak languages from historically marginalized cultures, but how when brown people, for example, speak their own native tongue in a Western country, they're looked down upon, they're called uneducated, they're seen as less, and they're even seen as untrustworthy or suspicious. Especially with the main character being a translator, I feel like this story is really speaking to how there's nothing passive and there should be nothing passive about language and culture and our relationship to those things. Context matters, history matters, our intentions and the choices we make about what to say and how to say it is an active, living thing. Anissa is also a deeply imperfect, fucked up character who's trying to commodify and exploit language for her own professional and personal gain. She's not interested in learning extinct languages, native languages, or languages from the global south. She's trying to learn German and Russian so she can translate quote-unquote serious works. And that just really goes to show how even for the colonized, there is a colonizer living within ourselves that we have to learn to extinguish. So there's a lot happening in this book, and I think it has so much to offer. I do think it takes a big swing towards the end and tries to become meta and open-ended in a way that I don't think ultimately serves the story, but this was still so satisfying to read, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I took part in a book tour for Never Ever After by Sulin Tan. I received a finished copy courtesy of Color Pages Book Tours and Little Brown Books for Young Readers, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Natalie Nadas. This is the first book in Sulin Tan's new YA romantic fantasy series, and you don't have to have read any of her other books to read this one. It's a Chinese-inspired Cinderella retelling of sorts. Ever since the death of her uncle, the main character Yining has been shaped into a con artist and skilled thief by her cruel step-aunt, and together they make a living by robbing and deceiving folks. When Yining discovers an enchanted ring that could be the key to her independence and a brighter future, it's stolen by her step-aunt, and Yining is forced to venture into the heart of the kingdom if she hopes to get it back. And not only does she end up catching the eye of the ruthless and ambitious prince, but she also finds that her only ally in the palace is a cunning advisor from a rival court who might be keeping his own dangerous secrets. Content warnings for experienced classism, some explorations of parental death and grief, explorations of child abuse and child exploitation, some instances of injury, blood, and violence, brief descriptions of imprisonment and torture, brief depiction of animal cruelty, and some sexual content, including sexual assault. This is an exciting, fast-moving, deeply twisted take on the classic Cinderella narrative. It's unlike any other Cinderella retelling you'll find, mostly because the main character, Yining, is the furthest thing from timid and soft-spoken. She doesn't take anything sitting down, and she is anything but passive, especially when it comes to the trajectory of her own life. Yining is not content to let other people make decisions for her or make choices that take away what little control she has over her life and her agency. Because of her lot in life, she is desperate and hungry for any scrap of power she can find, and she will do whatever it takes to seize any semblance of power that comes her way. As a character, she's ruthless, she's ambitious, she doesn't care who she has to deceive or double-cross if it means that she has the power to forge her own future, and it's really thrilling to see the lengths to which she's willing to go. She's a deeply messed up character trapped in this political chess game where everyone has their own hidden motives, no one can be trusted, everyone's willing to risk everything they hold dear for a chance to get what they want, and that just makes it really exciting to read. I also appreciate how the story explores the idea that power bestowed upon you by someone else, or power that someone has given you permission to wield, isn't really power at all, especially if it comes with conditions or if it can be taken away at a moment's notice. There's also this through line about not just forging our own futures, but really taking ownership of them. Because even when the world has dictated our past and our history, the future and all the possibilities it holds is something that only we can discover for ourselves. All in all, I found this to be an incredibly twisty fantasy with so much adventure and complex court politics that it left me breathless at times. The characters are bold, dynamic, and anything but flat or one note. There's levels to each and every one of the main characters that you would not expect, and I like that. I can't wait to see what happens in book 2, and I give this first installment 4 stars. The last thing I read for the month was very short, so I'm gonna keep it short and sweet, but I read the short story The 6 Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. I listened to the audiobook, which unfortunately is a Bezos exclusive, exclusive and read by Saskia Marleveld. This is a fantasy short story about a young servant girl whose life is spared by the Saint of War so she can fulfill her destiny of becoming the kingdom's greatest warrior and most renowned knight. She eventually becomes a weapon in the hands of the prince, and though she keeps expiring and coming back to life, the war never seems to end, and the true cost of her undying loyalty continues to rise. Content warnings for graphic depictions of death, injury, blood, and war, some references to child abuse, and some fade to black sexual content. Again, I'll keep this brief, but I freaking love this. Believe it or not, this is the first time I've read something from Alex E. Harrow, and it definitely blew me away and left a very strong impression. Alex E. Harrow could write a masterclass on how to absolutely eviscerate a reader in 30 pages or less. To me, at least, this is a perfectly conceived, perfectly executed short story. The stakes are clear, the conflict is clear, it's easy to understand the story's conceit, the focus is on a few key characters who are fleshed out exactly as much as they need to be in order to make an emotional impact. And not only that, but it's asking really provocative questions about the dangers of unquestioning loyalty, whether being useful to someone is the same as being loved by them, and what exactly we're willing to sacrifice in order to feel like our lives have value of some kind. I read this because I heard at the very least it's a sort of spiritual predecessor to Alex's latest book, The Everlasting, which I plan to read soon, and it's so good that even if that doesn't turn out to be true in any way, I'm still really glad I gave this a chance. This story absolutely wrecked me in the best possible way. Again, it's only 30 pages, but it was 30 absolutely masterful pages in my opinion, and I just had to give it 5 stars. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read in October. If you've read any of these yourself, I would love to hear your thoughts, or feel free to tell me about your favorite book that you read in October down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.